Welcome to Frontier, an investment podcast by Foresight, where we discuss strategies, trends, and challenges shaping private market funds. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Foresight's Frontier podcast. This episode is Sowing the Future: Climate, Sports, and Sustainable Food Innovations. As ever, your two hosts today are Chris Holmes and myself, Dan Wells. We're both partners here at Foresight Group. Chris has just come back from some very exciting travels, including some times at the Olympics, for which I'm quite jealous. So Chris, today we're here to talk about food. That's the main course, you might say. As a bit of a starter, I thought we would have a bit of a chat about sports and climate change. And the reason that's in my mind at the minute is that I've recently listened to an audiobook on sports and climate change. I've been listening to this on my morning runs. It's a book called Warming Up by Madeline Orr, which is a fascinating read about the effect that climate is having on sports kind of across the board. And I think there's obvious areas like winter sports where we can all see it's having an effect already. But that opened my eyes to the fact that it's everything from American football to cricket to football, soccer, that is. Even surfing is being affected by coastal erosion, actually changing the way that surf breaks are working. So, Chris,
don't forget cycling in there, Dan. In terms of important sports, you should be talking about.
Sorry. I was about to tee you up with that one, Chris.
Oh,
but that's a very, very good point. But Chris, through my gnashing teeth of jealousy here in terms of your Olympics trip, so your recent Olympic visit, I wondered if you had any kind of reflections coming back from there on cycling or anything else.
well, I mean, first thing to say, what an amazing sporting spectacle the Olympics is. It really is something else. I think for those who were fortunate enough to be in London back in 2012, it had the sort of it felt very much the same vibrancy and excitement around the city. A lot of energy, which really does create such a unique atmosphere for those couple of weeks, and just fantastic to be able to see some of these amazing performances, which in a way is quite is unique in itself. These athletes have been training for 4 years in the run up to these games. A lot of pressure just on one moment. Sometimes the only moment in their careers to perform on the biggest stage. So it really was quite humbling to see all that in play. A lot of training and preparation and focus, which in some cases came down to just a matter of seconds, as we saw with the men's 100-meter final, which was an incredible event to see. So yeah, fantastic to be part of that. Very very pleased and happy to be able to travel to Paris along with everybody else. And it was certainly a very full city. It worked very well. I think the transport system was running well, and a lot of focus I know had gone on and around how to act in a sustainable way and utilize not only existing infrastructure but also to make the most of public transport to get all these spectators around. I think 14 million visitors to Paris came for the Olympics this year, which is an incredible number. But I guess linking to your earlier point, Dan, what did amaze me is how very hot it was. Just to spectate, and I must admit I wasn't moving very much in my seat. In fact, I was trying not to move very much in my seat, and I was really feeling for these athletes who were running around and having to endure these conditions, which in some cases they would have had very little preparation for. And I think this is something which we need to be fantastic to talk about. And obviously, as you say, you've been reading your book in terms of how climate change is affecting sports across the board. And I think with the Olympics, we saw this in terms of whether it's pollution in the rivers, heat for endurance events, air quality. All of this has impacted the Olympics. But in the same way, the Olympics is such a well documented moment in the year that it does put climate change on the front pages, which when we're openly talking about these events and the impact climate change is having on sports, there's no better platform than to talk about it through the Olympics. So in a funny kind of way, it was good to be able to discuss and read about these articles that came through at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. The World Economic Forum put out a piece on the 12th of August about climate change in sports. Just looking at that, picking up your point about just the heat in Paris, since Paris last hosted the Olympic Games 100 years ago, the city has warmed by 3.1 degrees during the July-August Olympics period. And I think, for anyone kind of following climate, that's a massive number, given that's a bigger number than the kind of the sort of average global temperature rises we're looking at. So I can really understand it must have felt hot there,
and that's that's a very pertinent figure to bring out, and that's clearly that's an increase for that particular venue. But we look at some of the other host cities to come for the Olympics, and one starts to cast some doubt over the ability to keep our athletes in the best shape and condition in these ever increasing temperatures. So. Certainly worthy of a conversation.
Absolutely, and I think you're right that of all sports, the Olympics is kind of the event to act as a focal point. Interestingly, heard Sadiq Khan talking a few weeks ago about a possible 2040 London bid, which would very much be anchored in reusing existing infrastructure, and obviously have a really strong sustainability objectives, and that definitely seems the way that things are going as we look to the future. Certainly for the Summer Olympics, that things will have to be a little bit different. And I think obviously there's there'll be lots of discussion about how that's going to be handled in LA. And especially some of the endurance events. When are they going to hold the marathon in LA? What about the cycling events?
Yep.
But yeah, it certainly seems there's a lot of thought going into that.
And indeed, when in the summer it is actually hosted, we're seeing these extreme temperatures in late July, early August, then does the Summer Olympics become the Spring Olympics or the Autumn Olympics? Just for these very reasons. So lots of things to consider over the next decade or so.
Yeah, definitely, and probably worth saying we're both fans of winter sports. We grown up skiing, and now take great pride in taking our kids skiing. And obviously, winter sports, if anything, are more directly and more obviously affected. And it's just kind of difficult, I would say, taking your kids skiing and then thinking about how things might be in the decades to come. Ultimately, there is adaptation that can occur to some degree, but it feels like in many of these sports, in particular winter sports, where things just will change, and that's kind of inevitable. And the more we can think about it proactively, and the more we can just think about how we can adapt to that, the better.
Exactly right, Dan. I think obviously the window is narrowing every year, isn't it? It's quite upsetting when you go to these ski resorts and see how much things have changed, literally just over a 12-month period. But when you see photographs of glaciers from 10, 20 years ago where they used to be, it's quite upsetting in a way, and it's really making these ski resorts think about how they remain economically viable. I think the stat is around 100 days per year of skiing time to be viable as a resort, and that's becoming ever increasingly close for some of these low level European resorts at the very least. But then it is forcing them to think a little bit differently about how they do operate as an area, and thinking more about attracting tourists in the summer, and promoting summer sporting events rather than just being a winter destination. But certainly an upsetting time for skiing enthusiasts around Europe.
Exactly. Probably worth adding a comment, of course, that whilst this is depressing, and it feels bad, obviously conversations about how winter sports are going to be affected in the future kind of pale into insignificance when you think about the impact that climate change is having on people around the world in other places, whether it be sub-Saharan Africa, places in South Asia, when it is genuinely more of an existential threat. So I think it's worth obviously having that context. But still, it definitely focuses the mind for us here, lucky enough to be enjoying sports like this. I would say from a positive perspective, it's great to see some of the initiatives that sport itself is kind of proactively putting together. Just to name a few, in the UK here we have BASIS, which is the British Association for Sustainable Sport, who are doing fantastic work across the board, raising awareness for this. In specific sports like cricket for Climate is an initiative that is headed by Pat Cummins, the Australian cricket captain. Cricket itself is a sport that will be particularly heavily affected by climate change. Protect Our Winters is an organisation focused on snow sports and adaptation to climate. And in the motorsport world, interesting to see the number individuals, whether it be Sebastian Vettel or Lewis Hamilton, making stands on climate. Lewis Hamilton, famously a vegan. There are things going on to give us some hope for the future there.
Yeah, exactly. It's good to see these governing bodies actually taking it very seriously and putting in place some action plans. And I didn't want to finish up without mentioning a sport very close to my heart in terms of cycling and what they're doing. And I think it's actually quite quite apparent the impact of climate change on cycling events. We have 3 grand tours throughout the year in Italy, France, and Spain, and they really are being impacted by the weather more so than ever, and whether that's flooding or landslides or high winds, causing stages to be abandoned or shortened or even rerouted. It's certainly a direct consequence of climate change. And historically, the Tour de France has been held over 23 days in July, and we're now seeing temperatures close to 40 degrees in a lot of those areas which they cycle through. And a little bit like our point around the Olympics, should it still be held at that time of year? The impact on the athletes, the cyclists, to perform in those temperatures is getting ever more extreme. But to your earlier point, the governing body for cycling, the UCI, has recently released a 2030 mission statement. And that's really sort of setting out how all of the stakeholders in that sport can contribute to reducing the carbon emissions. The target is by 50% to 2030 and to be carbon neutral in the same year. So that's really good to see. How we achieve it and how close we get will be another matter. And I was digging around some stats in terms of what the Tour de France actually emits in terms of CO2, and it's something well over 200,000 tons equivalent per tour. And to put that into perspective, a flight from London to Tokyo emits 2 tons per passenger. So that's an incredible number of transatlantic flights just for 3 weeks of a cycling event, which is extraordinary to think about. The fans account for 94% of the event's indirect emissions. People travelling to see these cyclists come past. So, it's you don't want to take away from the spectacle on the one hand, but equally, you need to one needs to consider the impact on the climate, on our climate, on the other as well. So, what the solution is, I don't know, but certainly I think talking about it is the best thing we can do at the moment.
Yep, absolutely, fully agree, Chris. And then just more widely in the last couple of weeks, looking at kind of what's been going on in the news more generally with respect to climate and energy and policy. As you would expect, there's been a fair amount of coverage on things like heat waves, given the time of year, and worth kind of pausing on that for a minute just to reflect on how heat exhaustion, the risk of death through heat events is only going to get more pronounced in the future, unfortunately. And that certainly is something that obviously affects sport. That's something that I've learned in particular affects the NFL for particular reasons. It's a real danger. Also, then pivoting now towards the main subject of our discussion today, which is food. Coverage in the FT. This was back in July, but a piece in the FT about climate change is pushing up food prices and worrying central banks. So obviously, inflation, which is a key issue, obviously right now and has been for a couple of years. Clearly, food price inflation will continue to be a kind of core consideration there. So that sets some of the context for the discussion here. I would also just briefly mention that in kind of other news, there is just further really positive progress in general in Europe in terms of energy policy, and that being a favourable backdrop for the clean energy investment landscape in Europe, and that's something we can come back to in the next in the coming episodes. But it's really interesting to see the language out of Europe now, really focusing on clean energy being at the core of the competitiveness of Europe. And that's something of an evolution in the language from what we've seen kind of previously, when previously it was more about essentially just supporting renewable energy. Clean energy is now seen as being possibly the most important item or aspect of the continent's competitiveness. Anyway, we have a very esteemed guest today who's been very patient in listening to us prattle on about some of our favourite subjects in sport. So it's fantastic to welcome Antony Yousefian to the podcast today. Antony is a partner at the First 30, a nature tech venture fund, which has a particular focus and has particular insights in respect of food and agriculture and the future of all of that. So Antony, delighted to have you on the show today. Welcome. It would be great, first of all, just to hear a little bit about your background, Antony, and what brought you to where you are with the First 30.
Okay, how long we got?
As long as you need.
No, thanks very much. And it was really interesting to obviously hear this your passion for sports. I was obviously a keen sportsman myself. I was studying sports science, we kind of say A-level, but then obviously took the business and economic route into the capital markets. One thing that kind of stood out for me was, obviously on the sports science side, was when I learned that elite athletes achieve outperformance, or the difference between outperformance at the elite athlete level is on their environment. It is the food that they eat. It's the environment was the difference between winning and losing. And that just really struck with me. I was like, okay, so it isn't the training and everything else. It was all like, psychology, in which we know marginal gains. And it just, that has kind of struck me. So going back to the climate and environment, the performance, maybe the performance records, we will see less world records going forward. That may be one of the implications. So it's going to be a bit boring, isn't it, really, I suppose, watching the Olympics going forward. But anyway, sorry, I do enjoy a good sports chat as well. But obviously, something hopefully a bit more positive. As I mentioned, my background was in capital markets, in allocating capital into the pension for pension funds. I was very much a market trader, equities trader, and for me, then I kind of cut myself, understanding that alternative data were very important to kind of have an edge in the market, and then knowing the emerging markets back in 2007, 2008, 2009. And understanding China was also a competitive edge, or knowing where that would happen. So that's where I kind of specialized in. And that took me on to working for a Chinese investment bank called CICC. And amongst this kind of wave between 2007 and 2014, sustainability was a hot theme. On the buy side, when I was there, on the pension side, we were swelling under assets, under ESG mandates. We launched a global environmental fund, which essentially was a decarbonisation strategy, and that was incredibly popular. So that really kind of set my mind, like, this is an opportunity. People want these products. But how do we, as capital allocators, outperform? How do we find alpha? But then working for the Chinese investment bank, which eminently was backed by a sovereign wealth fund of China, their number one concern was security of supply chains. And for me, that was quite resonating. And under that, that was potentially the planet's is in decline. We as a nation want to invest globally to secure supply of things, materials, food being number one priority, as where we were allocated. So that really has struck with me. There we had one side private investors concerned on the increasing risks out there, and obviously that's been expressed with sustainability. And then here's one of the fastest growing nations on the planet is essentially thinking about this from a 40-50 year time horizon. So very well aligned. But we couldn't find investable opportunities. So that just led me into personally looking off the stock market into private equity opportunities into early stage. And given I was kind of cut myself in understanding that having a data advantage was imperative to have an edge, I was then thinking about how could we apply modern technology to understand the environment better, then we can potentially understand how to allocate capital better into these sustainability objectives. So that just led me all the way to early stage, where I essentially joined and also founded two companies in the startup space. And we can kind of probably dig into that, I suppose, as we kind of get talking. I know you've got a couple of questions, and I'll probably frame that as well. I think you got a question on technology versus nature, but it was there that I basically saw that the value of nature was incredibly valuable and outperformed kind of the modern thought process of how we should produce food. And then I realized the value and the power of soils, nature-based solutions. And then I was like, this is what everyone is looking for in terms of climate, biodiversity, food security. We need to invest in nature-based solutions. And I've ever since, after building 2 startups in this space, feel like I can add more value now, going back onto the capital allocation side, on the venture capital side, and supporting innovations in that space. But we can get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Anthony, I've got to say, you're the perfect guest because you're asking yourself the questions and then answering.
Yeah. We're not needed, Dan. We could just leave Anthony to
Exactly. Exactly. Now, before we get into the meat of the discussion, but all these food-based puns, I'm not trying to do them; they just keep coming out. So before we get, we're going to dig into this, as you said, Anthony.
Yeah,
we've got to. So it is the overarching theme of the podcast series is about how we find investable opportunities. How do we mobilise institutional capital into the areas we're talking about? So with food and with nature, we've put a poll together. And we've asked our network, our investor network, kind of what they think. Chris, would you like to run through poll results just to put you completely on the spot here, and I can chip in with thoughts as well?
That's absolutely fine, Dan. So the poll question was: considering the rising concerns around food security and climate change, how do you see the role of private markets evolving in supporting sustainable food systems? And the results have come in, and a little drum roll if we have the ability to do that. Top of the results list was with 38% focus investment in nature-based solutions like soil restoration and regenerative agriculture, much to Anthony's delight, I'm sure, and we can big thumbs up there. So I'm sure we can delve into that a little bit more. Not too far behind, increasing investments into indoor and controlled environment farming, which I'm sure has a role to play, but no doubt we can debate the merits of each of those. Equal as well to that score at 24%, supporting innovation in alternative proteins and plant-based foods, which is really quite an innovative sector, certainly from an investment perspective, and it'd be good to perhaps delve into some of the details there. And lagging a little bit behind, but no doubt playing an important role in all of this, is investing into the circular economy and helping to reduce food waste and making the most of what we create in the first place. So a good set of results there, Anthony. Maybe I could throw it back to you just for your initial sort of quick reaction.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I think if you did this poll 10 years ago, or when I was kind of getting into this, into the early stage innovation space, I reckon increasing investments into indoor agriculture and controlled farming would have been like a different percentage, much higher. It was we have been leading on this narrative of feed the world. This kind of narrative of we've got an extra 2 billion people coming, and how are we going to feed the world because we're running out of space and land? And so that is the obvious potential opportunity, and it still is part of the potential solution. But I think in the last, I've said to you, why I've been part of it in the last 5 years, this understanding of soil health, understanding of nature's value and what it can actually deliver. This is why I think we're starting to see capital allocate towards and understand the value, the capability of nature-based solutions, and the return on equity and investment essentially you can get there.
And that's an interesting point you finish on there in terms of return on equity, the return on investment, which is actually quite hard to articulate for this sector when you compare it with other forms of infrastructure, renewable energy generation, other forms of and other topics and sectors which we typically invest into and can understand revenue streams. We can sort of analyze and risk adjust them. What in your mind would sort of contribute to that return? Is it very much a long-term play? Is it around carbon pricing? What is it? What are the key drivers, do you think?
Yeah. Okay. Let me take you back to where I kind of our personal aha moment was. So it's a nice setup there, Chris. I appreciate it. When I first startups, I was basically started to build out was a company called 30 Megahertz, and we were developing wireless IoT systems. Think about it, wireless sensors inside greenhouses to help farmers optimize their conditions, give them real-time visibility of the conditions to then optimize the plant. And they didn't really have that high definition picture. And so yes, it was about this is the intensification process, and these are most of our customers, and we're obviously scaling around the world. And one of our biggest scaling markets was the pharmaceutical crop industry into making medicinal crops for medicine, and this became one of our biggest customers. But then I found a set of growers that were essentially not indoors inside the indoor hydroponic system. They were outside in soil in a polytunnel, so it was elementally protected, covered, but they were achieving higher biomass, in other words, yield in terms of the plant growth, and also the quality of the product was far superior than the one my customers, who are probably some of the best growers I've ever met in the world, on the indoor side in terms of scientific, and understanding of how plants work. And I was like, wow, what are you doing here outside? What is this black magic that you've essentially sitting on? What's this IP? I said, oh, it's called soil. 4 billion years of R&D has gone onto that, but we only know 1% of the species in there, but there's a lot of but we're working with nature. It's called soil health. We've just got incredibly high soil health. So for the listeners, I think one of the best stories is like if you scoop a teaspoon of soil, there's more life in that teaspoon of soil, organisms and life forms, than there is people on the planet. As it blows people's minds. And it's just like, and we only know 1% of those species in there. We still don't understand what they do, but obviously there's bacteria, there's fungi, there's nematodes, they're all kind of eating each other, and there's this whole economy, if it is like wars going on, if you want to think of it like that, between these species. And they're the ones providing and releasing the nutrients and providing the availability of these nutrients to the plant. So for me, I was just like, wow, and then we dig into it, the plant is operating seemingly like, go back to sport, it's like a cyclist on the top of its game at the Olympics, like in terms of its ability to convert enzymes into proteins. And it's like, this is just off the energy efficiency that's happening here is just crazy. So it's just like, what are they doing here? So for me, it was just so compelling. Like, we just do not understand this, and we need to grow this way. Now, the incentives there was the buyer wanted quality. The quality was nutrient density. In this case, it was like THC, which is cannabinoids. So I'm talking about the sativa, cannabis plant for like epilepsy drugs. So I was like, why don't we do this in the rest of farming? And they were like, you should, but like, there's no incentive. So that compelled me then to kind of found another business measuring some of these outcomes, essentially. But yeah, the economics going back to so that you had better yield, better quality, so you're going to get paid more. And then their inputs were absolutely minimal. There's no lights, there's no chemicals, there's no pesticides, because these plants aren't sick. Pests or insects that eat plants, they have kind of evolved to kind of remove the bad plants. Did you think about it, right? So like they are there, they kind of eat the litter. It's great, again, 4 billion years of R&D by nature. It's pretty smart. But it's like remove the excess biomass or things that shouldn't survive. And that's what pests or insects, some of them do. And yeah, we're kind of keeping weak plants alive, but these plants are strong. They're not a red beacon to pests. They don't get attracted. So they don't have to pay pesticide bills. So it's unbelievably compelling when you actually get into the science and understand it deeper. It's like, we need to scale this and we need to understand it more. So yeah, the ROI there was just so compelling, despite being the idea and concept of indoor controlled environment.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a win-win in terms of reducing your costs on the one hand and increasing your yield and nutrient density on the other, and presumably being paid for that. So that's fantastic to hear about. And I mean, you mentioned that being applied in terms of a sort of a covered environment. Do you think the same could also apply outside as well, in terms of general farming practices and techniques, in terms of regenerative agriculture? Do you think the same benefits could be achieved there?
Sorry, 100%. These guys were outside. They just threw a polytunnel over it just to kind of stop the rain, stop the wind, right? The yield there was purely coming from, let's be honest, from the soil health. That's where the delta was. But obviously controlling the environment, you can see it looking at photosynthesis rates of the plant. Yeah, when it's a bit windy, when it rains, guess what? Plants shut down, just like you and I, we go inside. It's quite interesting. They like to be in the nice Goldilocks zone, like you and I sitting in our rooms now, 22 degrees, 21 degrees, performing really well. It's the same for plants. So yes, the answer is yes. And I've seen that in so many use cases now with farms around the world who are shifting practices towards regenerative agriculture. And what is regenerative agriculture? Is the kind of the practice of essentially targeting improving life in the soil. So keeping crops always in the ground, keeping the soil always covered, not using these inputs essentially, or trying to reduce them down, and for example, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and just to be clear, herbicides and pesticides. Sides means death. So again, you're putting on products which kill things. Fungicides, again, fungicides. We need fungi in the soil, so you can see why this system is suddenly breaking down. We've been putting these toxins into our soil. So yes, the answer is it can work outside, but obviously inside as well. As we're learning about nature and then learning about its capability from the microbes to how these species interact with each other, from mycelium to algae, we can replicate that, right? We are very good engineers, I think, as humans, to then replicate and scale that up. And so for the more of the shocks we're going to have in the climate, it's inevitable in the near term. We're going to have to leverage some of these, this tooling of indoor agriculture as well for food security perspective.
Anthony, and just sort of picking that up, so taking growing indoors, there's obviously huge amounts of research and learning going on at the minute in terms of how things can be grown in glass houses, in vertical farms, whatever it might be. But are we losing something by not using the soil there? And to what extent is that a loss? And to what extent can we produce truly nutritious things indoors using LEDs?
Yeah, for me, the biggest one was when I saw these growers was like, hold on, you're sticking carbon in the soil. So obviously these plants are photosynthesizing. They are then turning the CO2 into sugars, which then the sugars essentially pass it on to the roots. The roots are then passed into the sugars, they pass on to the microbes, and then they feed the microbes, which then actually pass back nutrients to the plant. But in that process, you are basically sequestering CO2. If you basically be up, it's like a pipe. A plant is a pipe and is channeling CO2 into the soil, and when those microbes die, they basically become essentially organic matter, mineralize, and they basically can become very permanent for like 100 plus years. That's why the ground or the soil is our most this is where most of the carbon actually sits, outside of the sea. This is where a majority of our carbon is in the soil. I think like 3 or 4 times the amount of carbon is in our soil than there is in the atmosphere. So it's pretty obvious, again, like we should be leveraging these plants. So okay, we can use these machines called plants, which kind of push CO2 into the soil. They can store carbon in the soil. They can increase biodiversity, hold more water. So to be clear, how do we cool down the planet? It is the action of the plants turning water in the soil into gas and transpiring it. It gives off. That's why if you go walk around a forest system and stuff like that, or near plants, it's a bit cooler. It's them transpiring, and that air goes up into the clouds. They become clouds. Sorry, what we're going to say, and it's there as the heat is let go from the ground, essentially let go into space, right? And this is what plants do. They basically cool down the planet, and they cycle the CO2. So that is the opportunity. So it's a planet cooling mechanism. It can increase the nutrition for food that we need. It's food for everyone else in terms of animals and plants. So it's like, why would you not focus on this from a climate transition perspective? This is like the ultimate opportunity. So yeah, that's the difference of being indoors. Obviously, indoors is just about essentially channeling nutrients to humans, but essentially, in some cases, very inefficiently, because you're paying for power of the light, the LED, where you got it free in the sun. In some cases, it's not there all the time. You're having to pay for power in the airflow. You got to get that airflow going. Guess what? You got wind outside. You can kind of naturally thing. You got to pay for power to make the nutrients, the chemicals, the fertilizers. Again, that's most of our atmosphere is nitrogen. It's 70%, right? And we're paying these chemical companies to create nitrogen, soluble nitrogen. I get why we did, because we needed to feed the world from after World War II, and it's a great innovation. But still, it's like we could be smarter than that.
Yeah.
So I hope that gives you.
Well, that's kind of the biggest question here, isn't it? It's like, to what extent do we need nature? Do we use nature? Or to what extent we do things ourselves, man-made? Whatever ultimately man-made means. I mean, obviously everything has come from a natural source in some shape or form. I read recently George Monbiot's book Regenesis, which I think makes many strong arguments. I read it at the same time as another book, English Pastoral, by James Rebanks, and interesting to compare the two, because essentially there's two sort of conflicting messages. So one essentially Monbiot's conclusion is that it's just too hard to grow things whilst also maintaining and restoring ecosystems. So really, the future has to be indoors, and in particular things like artificial proteins, precision fermentation, just because of the massive sustainability benefits, in particular taking out meat and livestock out of the food production industry. Whereas Rebanks, who is a farmer himself from many generations in Cumbria, essentially is making the case for just lots of learning over time, applying the newest knowledge and learning to the oldest knowledge and learning, and essentially farming in balance with nature. So do you have any hunches on that? And I guess the question there is that can we continue to produce enough food to feed 8 to 10 billion people alongside nature, or do we ultimately need to take it outside nature and take it indoors?
Yeah, they're kind of binary kind of points sometimes there. It's, the best way, okay, just to do some basic math, sometimes I just try to kind of weigh up the ideas, but my understanding is that George's point is very much in a carbon perspective, as I understand. He's that kind of argument, and a lot of the argument is like focusing on the carbon tunnel vision of like there's too much CO2 in the air. But as I just explained, then it's the planet actually was able to handle much more CO2 in the air previously. Many years ago, millions of years ago. It's just the cycling of the carbon which is slowed down. We've got less big things, less big trees, less big animals, less things eating each other. So it's just not cycling and getting that water into the air. And I think we've degraded something like, I can't remember how many million hectares, and my mind's gone blank now. Is it 800 million hectares globally? But I think we've removed something like 40% of green land from which is doing this process of keeping the planet in balance, right? That's like 40% of the land is essentially degraded, right? And my understanding is of the solar radiation that's coming to the planet. Like we're in imbalance by like, I'd say 2 or 3%, but that's the fine imbalance we have, in terms of got too much, we're heating up. And so we kind of point towards, CO2 trapping heat, which it does. Don't get me wrong, but it's the fact of we're not cycling that CO2 is the issue, and storing it, which we're going to say in kind of nature-based solutions. So I think there's an argument where James Rebanks is right, and George, but we need to give land back to working with nature, but you can have both together. Food and nature can come hand in hand, and it's just that we've decided to separate the two and unbundle the two. And that's also what George is referring to. Like we've got these feedlot industrial systems where we've taken cows off field, stuck them indoors effectively, like vertical farming, not vertical farming cows, but they're industrial cows, and then we're growing crops to feed those cows. Totally agree. And we don't need to do that. And guess what? And this is the stuff that we are investing into and the data to understand this, that cows or animals, livestock, herbivores, these, as the best way I like to think about these things, they're kind of plant digesters. There is excess material which is on the land from the forest and stuff like that, of like plants that have died. They need eating, they need digesting. There's only so much the microbes can do and do. So guess what? It's what nature designed it, that these animals take up this excess litter, they then digest it, and then they just give us fertilizer onto the soil, right? So I think we need to just rethink how we have animals and reintegrate them onto the system. And I think we're going to get massive increase in productivity, improvement in health of ourselves. And then we'll be able to have a food system which is actually working with nature. Of course, if you completely rewild it and give it back to nature, then I'm sure we'll get some superior biosphere improvements. But I think in the end, we know as humans, we need to make the economical, pragmatic solution. So this is where I think regenerative agriculture has a real strong place to play as we kind of transition and understand nature and work with it. And it's quite clear in history that nature can do so much more. It can handle many more people on this planet. It's no problem. It can handle many more big things, but we just destroyed its function. So let's invest into understanding that more and leverage and work with nature. It's the greatest opportunity of our lifetime.
Fantastic comments there, Anthony. I'm interested because we've talked a lot about the role that animals can play on our land in terms of maximizing the yield from our soil as well. I'm interested actually to swing back to some of the results from the poll around alternative proteins and plant-based foods, and how what role they could play there, because clearly trying to feed a growing population just in terms of the land that we have, and I think to your earlier point, it's shrinking year on year. Are these alternative proteins which we keep hearing about, and some are more far-fetched than others, but perhaps they do play some of the role to feeding our growing population, and some of the answer there, as well as the regenerative agricultural aspects that you've mentioned already.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to regenerative agriculture, like we are degrading the land because of the way we farm, the industrial system of the arable crops, of just like monocrop, one crop. You don't see that in nature, like multiple species. You need one crop of fields and corn. It's 3 different crops essentially just to feed the breadbasket. And it's like this way of growing, yes, is degrading the land, and it's making it like, okay, if we're going to keep farming that way, then we need to maybe move into something like alternative protein. I think it's, if you go and work with regenerative agriculture, you don't degrade land, you improve land. You can take back old land and restore it. So like again, I don't really buy into the point of like there's not enough land. There's definitely enough land. We're just not maximizing its potential from the evidence that I see. But I do see a place still for essentially plant, should we say alternative proteins in time. But again, it feels very much early vertical farming. And I think we're seeing that play out in the venture capital markets. Like I was obviously on the founder side when vertical farming was happening, and I was like an iOS to some of these vertical farms. I could tell you then, like I couldn't understand why people were allocating there, because the return on capital just didn't make sense. These things weren't working. And again, I've seen that in the last 4 years. I think it's been the same in alternative protein space. It's like if you do the numbers and economics, it's like this is nowhere near. I understand about being early, but like it's like you're completely ignoring this very high ROI system over here called regenerative agriculture, where you can get a high return and deliver on all your impacts. Because most of these people putting money into those spaces is like on the idea of sustainability and reducing carbon and impact work. So I will have strong opinions, but loosely held. So if you can prove to me that the economics truly work in alternative proteins, then I will, I can invest there. I'll be very, very much interested in it. But going back to regenerative agriculture, it's the nutrient density. I should go back to the human health side, which became for me the most compelling opportunity of that space. Is like, the way that we farm today, we have lost the nutrients in our food. So when people say feed the world, they're talking about calories, but we're actually growing calories, increasing calories which are empty is the best way to think about it. Like there's more and more studies coming out showing that, like for example, in broccoli, I think they've got half the iron now than they used to have. There's a rice study recently where CO2 is going up in the air, so we're getting more growth. But why is protein and iron and calcium all collapsed as well in those crops? It's because we've destroyed the soil health and its function and ability. And now we are paying close to, I think it is 10 trillion a year in costs towards healthcare from the food system. So if people are looking for a business case to kind of do regenerative agriculture or do nutrient dense food, you now have it. When the food system is less than that, right? Or the agricultural system's like 2 or 3 trillion, the whole food system's 8. You're now spending more money already, and we have it obviously here in the UK. It's always the hot political debate. A healthcare system which is a breaking point because people are just, chronic diseases, and 7 out of 10 deaths in the world are chronic diseases.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Anthony, you're making a very strong case for nature here and the role that nature has to play. I want to before we end, I want to bring this background to how we mobilise capital and to to sort of make the case for the other side of the argument, which is infrastructure, using infrastructure to produce food. I'm gonna ask Chris a question here. Obviously, there are reasons why having food grown indoors can make sense because of having a smaller footprint, and also because anything that looks and feels like infrastructure, it has large amounts of big bits of metal, has long-term offtake contracts potentially with someone that you're selling your produce to. In some respects, it's easier to mobilize capital there because there are existing pools of capital with pension funds, insurance funds allocated to infrastructure, allocated to clean energy, where this is less of a leap. I love regenerative agriculture. I think restoring nature is fundamental to what we need to do in the coming decades, along with decarbonising our economy. But also investing in ag, whether you own land or if you have exposure to carbon revenues, is quite different, and that's quite a lot for investors to get their heads around. Chris, from your perspective, making the case for infrastructure to produce food. Any thoughts you might have there, and we might talk a little bit about some of the examples that we've actually been working on at Foresight in terms of producing food indoors in areas like aquaculture.
You raised some good points there around infrastructure-like characteristics for these projects, if I can use that phrase, that investors can get their heads around. It's more tangible when we talk about real assets, that we talk about contracts to sell things that have a value that you can then analyze and use as a way of calculating what your return might be. So in a way, when we look at how to mobilize private capital into this exciting area, there are some barriers to overcome, which perhaps don't exist to the same extent in other areas of whether it's regenerative, or whether it's aquaculture, as you mentioned there, other forms of infrastructure that are there to help grow protein essentially in a more sustainable way. And you teed it up quite nicely there, Dan, in terms of one of our investments, which we think is quite exciting in the aquaculture space. And we talked about land, but we haven't talked about our seas or our rivers, which are being overfished and not cared for, and how that's impacting upon our ability to extract protein from those sources. And a way to tackle that in the near term, before we start to clean up our rivers and restock our seas, is to build aquaculture facilities. And we're backing one in Norway, which is a land-based trout facility. It's high up in the Telemark Mountains. It uses fresh water that comes through that area. It uses renewable electricity from an existing hydro facility. And when fully built out, it will help to grow around 8,000 tons of trout every year in a real controlled way. So no disease, no need for chemicals. Water being recycled almost at 100%. So I think it's a great demonstrator of what we can do on land. Clearly not an answer to everything, but perhaps one that should go hand in hand with our solutions around regenerative agriculture as well.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's one of those classic ones where it's going to be indoors, it's going to be outdoors, it's going to be technology, it's going to be nature. And Anthony, probably you better than anyone, is well positioned to explain how nature and technology go together. In fact, nature is technology. Anthony, I've got one last question from my side. You've talked in the past about food being healthcare. What do you mean by that, and how would you explain that to someone in the pub in very simple terms?
Yeah, I mean, the infrastructure point is absolutely right. And it's one of the reasons when I left the financial industry to kind of go focus on greenhouse, to be honest with you as well. It's just like this was the obvious opportunity. It's interesting you mentioned infrastructure. is one of the reason why I went into the greenhouse industry. I essentially focused around there because I saw that obviously we needed more infrastructure for that food security, which is the point you made there, kind of, Chris. I totally agree, and it's all part of the solution. But I suppose the focus we found on our fund and why we're focusing on is essentially investing in that infrastructure as well, but the digital infrastructure. When I say that is that with this transition to nature, what we're saying is that we're going for a paradigm shift in understanding about supply chains, in that we're accepting the complexity. We've essentially built a very good availability system of supply of nutrients, but at the expense of obviously seemingly the planet and guess what, our human health. So we need to shift. Now to shift, we need to basically put the complexity back in and understand how to optimize and work with nature's resources. So we think this is where obviously we've done very well in the last, through the explosion in the internet and everything else and technology, that we have this huge bandwidth now, compute power. What if we could apply that compute to understand nature? Like, that is massive. That is absolutely super exciting. So that's what we're trying to think about. And so we're trying to build the digital connection between soil health all the way to human health. And we think the idea of tethering human health to climate action is the way to make humans change behavior. Because asking humans to change behavior because of CO2, we've seen it struggle and seen it on the corporate side. The business case is not there. But the business case on the human health side is, we think, is the greatest, certainly let's just point towards on the food side. So yeah, food is healthcare. I mean, as I was kind of mentioning, we're spending so much on chronic diseases. One of those chronic diseases is essentially diabetes, for example, and that's coming from obesity, essentially. And that is becoming kind of a large drag on the economy. 1 in 5 in the UK, I think, are between 16 and 60 are economically inactive. Right, and you can see the ballooning numbers around the NHS system, and you look into it. It's the food system, as I said to you, which is driving that. So we've seen that when people there's these Medicare programs, for example, in the US going on, when people are actually given nutrient dense food, in other words, let's just say local, regenerative from healthy soils, they are able to reverse diabetes. Have you ever heard of that before? I always thought it was like manage diabetes. It's absolutely fascinating. So like the ROI on that. So we're seeing these early days in these programs where they're prescribing basically this type of food to people. They turn up every week, get free vegetables and veg from their insurance company, and the insurance company is spending $25,000 a year, I believe, on these programs in terms of these programs. And it's costing them $5,000. So the ROI is like significant just by giving them this type of produce. It's just getting them the nutrients they need. Like the nutrient deficiency in humans is actually quite huge. And so look, we've been investing in the infrastructure for that. So like we've just invested in a company called Audacious, which is measuring the nutrient density of food and making that data point very cheap and available for the food system. And for us, that's really exciting. We can then you will soon be able to see brands on the shelf competing with each other, saying that my milk or my grains, my bread is 10 times more nutritious. Like none of this back of the label stuff. That data is all old and incorrect. I can show you data, and happy if anyone reaches out, we can talk about it. But like I've seen a lot of information about, for example, milk on the shelf. The profile, some of it has limited protein in it, for example. Like 1 gram of protein, it says it's got 8, and some has got like 14, 15. But you don't know that as a consumer, but that's on how it was grown or how it was produced. And if brands can start competing on that and say that mine is the best on the market, then you're going to see a shift in the supply chain. They're going to start sourcing from nutrient-dense growers, and they're from soil health, basically high soil health, which is, as we know, as we just talked about, is sequestering carbon, improving biodiversity, and producing great food, and we can produce a lot more of it. So it's like that is a way to shift the supply chain where it's an economic business case for the food industry to make more money. And the other argument for the opportunity here is because who's the most valuable, business in Europe right now? It's Novo Nordisk. It's like 10 times, 20 times the value of any food and beverage business. It is selling a product, or 40% of its sales, that makes us eat less. It's an obesity drug. called GLP-1, Wegovy and Ozempic. And so if a food company is out under massive attack and pressure at the moment, so they got climate change, supply chain disruption, labor issues, declining revenues from people not eating, now going to be eating less because they're on these obesity drugs. And it's been proven to essentially, make people eat less food, or a lot of this rubbish, sadly, that they do produce. So they're going to have to change. They're going to have to change. And it is there is an economic opportunity for them to capture a lot of value. And so we're trying to invest in the ways of knowing how to produce that food, from measuring the nutrient density through to understanding animal health, like gene expression. Epigenomics is a really exciting space for us, gene expression. So we saw in COVID that idea of RNA, understanding RNA. And there we can understand, if we go back to sport, if 80% of our performance, as we said, comes from the environment, what we eat and how we're in our environment. And you can see this data in the blood. And this is what epigenomics is essentially, is measuring in the blood what genes are turned on and off. You can see if the animal is stressed, sick, unwell today. You don't have to look at a camera. You can kind of get that feedback loop fast. And so we're starting to really understand there what practices are best for the welfare of the cow. And no surprise, better welfare equals better yield, better nutritional density of that, for example, that animal. And guess where that is? It looks like it's in when the animal is back in natural systems and just, doing what it wants to do, right? So you then have the data to remove that infrastructure, because it's not going to work long term. You're going to have these poor outcomes and poor return on capital. And then we're trying to invest all the way down on that measurement and digital infrastructure all the way to soil health. And we're trying to build that link. And we think by understanding that, building that digital infrastructure, we can then understand what are the things we need to scale up. We know some of them are. I'm not going to sit here and saying that we don't know what they are, but we've still got a lot to learn about nature. And that's what's the exciting thing about it. And we think that's where the venture opportunities are. There's going to be disruption in this space on a massive scale, but for the benefit of all of us from a human health perspective. And, arguably in the whole human health angle, I haven't even mentioned the word CO2 there at all, which I think is quite exciting.
Yeah, okay. I think that's fascinating. I mean, I think the key takeaway there being investment opportunities across the board, all the way from venture to infrastructure investing, to kind of broader real assets, underpinned by that notion of food being healthcare. There is obviously a particular irony at the minute. You were talking about Ozempic and the kind of the revenues and market capitalization that now has, and if you see that sort of sat alongside the market capitalization of food businesses, we haven't even mentioned processed food here, but obviously that's all kind of part of it. It's like, essentially as a society, we're having to pay to eat processed food, and then we're having to pay to eat the drugs to make us not want to eat the processed food. So, I think there's clearly there's opportunities there. Chris, I'm going to hand back to you for a minute, see if there's any reflections from your side in terms of wrapping things up, or any other questions for Antony.
The only reflection I was having when Antony was describing all of that was actually, how do we get that information out to the consumer? Because it's all well and good that we have practices that are increasing nutrient density of our food, but if we're not aware of that, or unable to make the choice, then we've achieved not a lot. And I know that a lot of work over the last few years has gone into information on labelling and packaging, but I think more education could also help in terms of allowing consumers to make that choice between certain food products, and to support essentially support those farmers who are putting into place practices which do provide a nutrient dense food versus anyone else. So that was the reflection I was having whilst listening to that interesting points that Antony was making. So
I would I would just say, like, education is I totally agree, a huge thing, and I would love to put money towards investing in that kind of communication of that. Obviously, we're trying to invest in the data layer to kind of make that possible, but if I had to do one thing, I would probably reintroduce something like soil health back into the curriculum, a soil literacy. Imagine what your children learning how to compost, understanding all the microbes, and understanding how circular economy truly works. I think would create a lot of innovation from children coming through and knowing It's quite amazing. I find it like when I learned about soil health, crazy, right? 2016, I had this like shock on my face. I just found this new technology, and it's like every time I talk to people about it in this space, they have the same almost reaction, and they're in climate investing. Some people, and it's like this is and it's crazy. The education isn't there. But I think content that is out there on Netflix these days, and it's getting very easy to communicate. I think that's why I think your survey is really interesting. I was not expecting that. I was expecting it to be a bit more balanced, but I think we are seeing, if you do search these keywords like this, like accelerating change and understanding, and this dissemination of information is quite powerful. So these trends are not long-term trends. I think they can move at pace.
Yeah, absolutely. Anthony, thank you very much for your time today. This has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I think sort of summing things up, key points being here, just the power of nature. 4 billion years of R&D is something that we can't ignore. You just made a point there about soil literacy. I think that's such an important point. Probably going back in history to when we were all hunter-gatherers, we probably had a much better handle on the soil and how it all works, and we're now somewhat divorced from that. And then food as healthcare. I think what a fantastic kind of concept, and a way to underpin things, and the economic basis for the importance of food within health, and also broader climate. Antony Yousefian, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to our next episode of the Frontier podcast.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Antony.